How do you feel about these, or rather 2 more Britons being captured?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say this word mercenaries is not one that we've heard much in the last few years. It reminds me, I don't know whether you remember, there's a book called The Dogs of War by Frederick Forsyth. And this mercenary business is rather like the dark web in today's terms. So it's quite unusual, but it is important. And these guys are obviously, under real pressure here, and their families will be really worried. When we look at military operations, we the British talk about the whole force. So we talk about regular soldiers who've signed up and their career is professional soldiers, serving the state, serving abroad, wherever. We then have reserves who are training in day-to-day work, but have a normal job, and then for a particular operation might be deployed to support the regular forces. Then we have contractors who go on operations sometimes, particularly the Navy take people with them, and other contractors who come and do various jobs on these operations. And within that, we then have private security companies and private military companies. And the Russians have an organization called the Wagner Group, which support them. And the sort of differentiation, the balance between private military company and a mercenary is a bit murky, really, is the truth. But essentially, mercenaries will be people who are getting paid by some sort of organization to do the fighting. And that used to happen a lot in Africa, for example.
Well, it's not the first time that Russia has used this word, particularly in some way trying to point a finger of blame at anyone fighting against them, but particularly British mercenaries. I mean, does it make their predicament very dangerous? Does it? I mean, would Russia see them as a bona fide target for maybe even a death penalty?
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think they're using this as, in inverted commas, for propaganda purposes, if you like. I'm sure these guys will be on trial, and I sadly suspect they'll be found guilty and probably given a death sentence. That's what happened to the 2 British guys earlier this year. Now, whether that would actually be carried out or not is something completely different. I don't know the circumstances that obviously it's going to unfurl in the weeks ahead, but it's possible that they will then use them as bargaining chips in negotiations, prisoner exchanges, or whatever. But sadly, and particularly for the families, this is not going to be resolved quickly. It'll drag on for weeks, if not months, I think. Indeed, potentially even years.
And every time the British government talk to the Russians about it, they're legitimising Russia's claim to that part of Ukraine.
Yeah, and it doesn't. You know, we have a lot of what I call megaphone diplomacy going on in this campaign, and I don't want to point fingers at particular individuals, but talking about pushing Russia out of the whole of Ukraine, including Crimea, and so on. The Russians, we need to understand how the Russians perceive this. It's not that we agree with them, but one of the old maxims from Sun Tzu 2,500 years ago was, if you understand yourself and you understand your enemy, then you need not fear the outcome of 1,000 battles. And we need to understand Putin, and we need to understand their mentality and their psychology. And sadly, by simply, as I say, using megaphone diplomacy, when you then come to issues like this, where you want quiet diplomacy and you want to be able to talk, under the radar and have sensible negotiations, it becomes much more difficult. And the Russians are will undoubtedly use this.
That's really interesting, Tim. So you're saying that maybe the British government could try and put themselves in Putin's shoes more?
I think so. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, every British commander that I've worked with, and indeed, if you use somebody like, well, in World War II, a lot of senior British commanders would have photographs of the senior enemy commander and would understand who they were, what their background was, how they saw the world, what their career looked like. So Montgomery was well known as a very, very determined. We used to call it teeing up the battlefield. He would not get involved in a battle until he had sufficient combat power in his own mind to defeat the enemy. Rommel was completely different. Rommel was much more maneuver warfare and would prepared to take risks and would do all sorts of things that would never have entered Monty's mind. So understanding the context of that and then enables you to put together your own plan. And that's true today as it was back then.
But we do understand a bit about Putin, don't we? And I'm sure that our intelligence service understand more, that he wants to rebuild or certainly reclaim those territories he considers should still be part of the old Soviet empire. And interestingly, when you also you watch reports coming out of the Donbass region, for instance, there are local people there who feel a greater affinity to Russia than to Ukraine and actually blames Vladimir Zelensky for causing this war.
Oh, that's true. And there are commentators around, even here in the UK, who would argue that, we're partly to blame for this because we've allowed NATO to expand, to push hard against the Russian borders and so on. So, yes, in that context, but using that as an example, Russia has a historical sense of wanting to be a serious player in world events. And there's no doubt in my mind at all that Putin thinks that Kiev is the spiritual home of Russian orthodoxy. And we could go into his own faith, in inverted commas, and his support from his Archbishop Krill, who undoubtedly is supporting him on this, and probably has convinced each other that this is a just war, a just campaign. Crimea is historically Russian, they would argue. These eastern provinces, and indeed elsewhere, are lots of Russian speakers, and they belong to Russia. It's rather like Nazi Germany in the late 1930s, arguing about how the Germans in Austria were part of Germany and so forth. So, this is not unusual in one sense, but Putin genuinely believes this stuff. There's no good of saying it's not right, it's not fair or whatever. He genuinely believes it. And therefore, in the context of how we take him on, how we support Ukraine, the messages we send, they have to be seen in that context as we put together our strategic intent of how we tackle this campaign.
Is it inevitable, then, that those contested regions will, in the end, have to be given up to Russia?
Well, I don't think it's inevitable, and nothing is certain, but I think it's probable, certainly possible. The Russian speakers that you talk about there, I think, from what I'm hearing, are pretty unhappy with the way that Russia has, undertaken this campaign. I think initially, Putin and his generals and the people who put this campaign together had a relatively softly approach. They thought that by surrounding Kiev, by putting the Donbass under pressure and doing it relatively quietly and gently, I mean, all these things are relative, as I say, but nonetheless, that everybody would say, okay, fine, lots of Russian speakers, they need to be part of Russia. That didn't work out for them. So they're now undertaking this, really attritional-based campaign, and they are prepared and are using, a lot of combat power. They're using 20,000 artillery shells a day in this campaign in the eastern Donbass. So, they are, in my mind, they will take these two eastern provinces. And the question then is, what do they do then? Now, they have not retracted from the fact that they have said they want the whole of Ukraine. Yeah. So it's possible that they will carry on. It's possible that they will try and secure Odessa. But it's also possible, and maybe probable, that having secured those eastern provinces, they will then say, okay, let's go to a negotiating table. And the problem for the Ukrainians is, do we acknowledge and accept that they keep those provinces in the fear that in 4 or 5 years' time, the Russians will have another go to secure some other province? Yeah. So I think the Ukrainians are going to be very reluctant to give these provinces up. And they're being supported in that by Western NATO powers who are giving them equipment to defend at the moment, but are now talking about giving them offensive capabilities in order to retake those provinces, which is a different ballgame.
If that scenario plays out, doesn't it leave egg on the face of NATO as well? And we'll have to ask ourselves, what position will we be in a few years' time too? We've supported a war that, frankly, has been lost.
Well, we don't know how it's going to turn out. And my view is that NATO has done pretty well. I mean, it's not completely unified. There are Germany and France and Italy take a different perspective of some of these issues for all sorts of reasons, particularly energy related, of course. But overall, NATO has come together extremely well. And the fact that Finland and Sweden have now joined and Turkey's agreed to that, is an important step forward. So we cannot fight you. We cannot use our own combat power in Ukraine. Ukraine is not part of NATO, and I think it's absolutely right that we have not tried to, set up air power or air corridors or whatever in Ukraine. But yeah, it's possible that Ukraine will come out of this badly, and that all the support we've given them has not been sufficient to enable them to win through. But when people talk about winning, these words are important. In the old Cold War days, we talked about détente, defend, deter, destroy. These words are important in terms of how you put together your military campaign. And when people talk about winning, what do they mean by that? What do they mean by defeating Russia as opposed to destroying Russia or pushing them out of the whole of Ukraine?
Tim, we'll have to leave it there.
There's a long way to go in this campaign.
We'll have to leave it there.
It's going to go on for months, I think.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.